Welcome to Feeling Beings Who Think, a podcast project that seeks to find wisdom in conversation through the stories and personal reflections of regular people like you and me. My name is Ariane Rice, and I'm really grateful you're here. So let's get started. Okay, here's a question. What do you think it means to be a holy person? Way back in 1917, a German philosopher and theologian named Rudolf Otto wrote a book, The Idea of the Holy, and it sought to answer that question. Now, if I ask you, are you a holy person? I have a feeling you might laugh out loud. Who, me? Don't be ridiculous. I do this, I do this, I do that. None of those things are holy. I mean, people who are holy are different. They are so much better. They are the Mother Teresas or Dorothy Days or Nelson Mandelas of the world. They live their beliefs in a way that most of us, myself included, find hard to even aspire to on a regular daily basis. Well, in this book, The Idea of the Holy, Otto said that holiness is not that. It is not a moral perfectionism. It is not something you and I can manufacture or create within ourselves. It is quite the opposite. It is an experience of the numinous, an experience of the divine. And I don't know what that word divine means for you, but I believe that you have experienced the divine in your life. And I encourage you to trust your intuitive definition of that word. Well, my guest today is a returning one, my close friend and colleague, the Reverend Mark Collins. And I asked him back because I wanted to talk about something that I believe gets in the way of our experiencing the numinous in our lives. Those internally integrated beliefs of shame. Stories that you and I tell ourselves that invite, in the words of Brené Brown, those two shame voices. Who do you think you are? And you are not good enough. And to prompt our conversation, we watched a YouTube video from the late 80s of John Bradshaw. He spoke on the topic of his book, a bestseller, it might even still be a bestseller, Healing the Shame That Binds You. And I'm going to put a link in the show notes, and I really encourage watching it, especially if you resonate with Brené Brown and enjoyed and got a lot from her TED Talk, The Power of Vulnerability, then I have a feeling you will appreciate this Bradshaw video too. Finally, today is Ash Wednesday, which may or may not mean anything to you, but in the church, it is a season of self-examination. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about the topic of shame with a good friend. And we explain a little bit more about the connection between shame and the church at the start of our conversation. I also want to thank Mark for his openness about his personal life, the way in which he beautifully shares the hard-won wisdom that he's gleaned from his own struggles and his healing. For me, this conversation was a numinous experience of putting words around what is holy about being a human being. And I am very grateful to be able to share it with you. So thanks for listening. And if Lent is part of your practice, then I hope you have a life-giving Lent this year. Hey, Mark Collins, welcome back.
Hi, Ariane Rice. I'm so glad to be back.
We are in or getting close to the season of Lent, although I think when this goes into the world, it is Lent. Lent being the season where we prepare ourselves for Easter, and also being a season in the church where we invite people into some self-examination.
Yep.
And sometimes people give things up. Sometimes people take things on in our own personal lives. My experience is that people can be kind of silly about Lent. You know, it's like you give up, you mentioned, you give up chocolate, you do something that seems like maybe something you're a little bit guilty about.
Mm-hmm.
but you don't necessarily, I should speak for myself. I don't want to talk about other people and make them feel bad about what they do or don't do. People can do whatever they like.
Whatever you need.
I like to look into this season and wonder, how can I grow in my relationship with God? How can I do some of that in whatever particular year I am in when Lent, happens?
When Lent rolls around.
Yeah.
But that's a beautiful practice. That's a wonderful way to observe Lent. It's a way in which we try to lead people into having a affirming and profitable and spiritually deep kind of Lenten practice. But and I know, and we're dealing with people in the world that we live in. And when they hear Lent and they hear the word sin and they hear the word you need to be penitent, that's wrapped up with a lot of shame and shaming behaviors that exist in the world, existed in many people's childhood around all sorts of things. Many of the people that are not part of our church or any church have rejected it because their experience of the message they get from Christianity is one of shame that engages with a kind of toxic shame that many of us carry. I can't tell you how many gay folk I've spoken to whose parents, when they first came out, or they first began to sense that their children were gay, they had many problems with it, their own shame being manifest in this person who was expressing a different sexual orientation or gender identity or whatever it is. And the closest tool they reach for is religion, to try to shame and discipline and control that aspect in children. So there are a lot of gay folk who have completely rejected, most forms of organized religion, certainly Christianity, because somebody has used it to shame them.
Okay. And so two things. One, you use the phrase toxic shame. Mm-hmm. And I think that's John Bradshaw, who I want to talk about. But you're also, saying one of the reasons why I became certified to do the work of Brene Brown was because I was introduced to that work through the Episcopal Church. What I uncovered or discovered in my week of that training was this was giving me common day language, regular, ordinary language to talk about the ways in which religion can be interpreted, and the Christian story in particular can be interpreted to shame people. Mm-hmm. And maybe ways in which I've even interpreted the story and my placement in it in a way that makes me just feel bad about being who I am. So you and I watched something on YouTube.
Well, whatever the topic of shame comes up, where a couple of names come quickly to the fore, and one of them is Brene Brown, who talks a lot about shame and vulnerability, and someone that we both know of and we've encountered in our journey, a fellow named John Bradshaw. You shared with me a video. We looked at this hour-long video presentation of John Bradshaw from a really great era in the 80s. I'm not sure when this was, but man,
you thought it was the 80s? I thought it was the 70s.
It was the 80s. Those ladies had on shoulder pads. The first book that I read, Healing the Shame That Binds You, was in the early 80s, not long after I first got sober.
And that, people, if they don't know how Brene Brown talks about shame in relationship to vulnerability, and her work is cultivating shame resilient skills. I don't want to do too deep a dive in there. I'll just say that her definition of shame is, and I actually pulled it up from Atlas of the Heart, so I wouldn't get anything wrong. Her definition is: shame is the intensely painful feeling or experience of believing that we are flawed and therefore unworthy of love, belonging, and connection. And if you don't mind, I led a class last weekend where we talked about living with boundaries, integrity, and generosity, and we dug into this work. And I just want to read a little bit of this list that she has in Atlas of the Heart, where she's utilizing what shame is. It's hard for me to say all these things at once. They're intense.
Okay.
Shame is hiding the fact that I'm in recovery. Shame is raging at my kids. Shame is bankruptcy. Shame is getting laid off and having to tell my pregnant wife. Shame is my boss calling me an idiot in front of the client. Shame is my husband leaving me for my next door neighbor. Shame is infertility. Shame is telling my fiance that my dad lives in France when in fact he's in prison. Shame is flunking out of school twice. Shame is hearing my parents fight through the walls and wondering if I'm the only one who feels this afraid.
Mm.
And I will tell you that when I did this class and read that last one, I started getting a little verklempt.
Yeah.
Just because I can so identify with that childhood Ariane. And sadly, I think I can also identify with an adult Ariane who was a parent in a house being angry and having a child who heard it.
But one of the interesting things is that to use this word again, triggering for some of us when those things happen, and not in other cases.
Sure.
When a child that's raised with access to their anger is allowed to be angry, then hearing mom and dad be angry is like, oh, I guess that's an experience of confirming that sometimes people have these feelings. This is a feeling called anger. I'm mad about something. And there are ways in which I can do something about that. And so ways in which I can't. I'm just going to feel a feeling. But if you're raised in a certain way where you're not given access to your feelings, they're not confirmed, they're not mirrored when you're very young, and you're taught that that there's something wrong with you for feeling a certain way, then when you have experiences like a DUI, like, it hooks up with the shame that has been instilled in you.
Yes. Okay. So I want to encourage people, if they're not familiar with John Bradshaw, and I'm going to put a link to this same video that you and I watched in the show notes to this conversation. And it is sort of a keynote summary teaching. It feels a little bit like you're watching an episode of Phil Donahue, which I remember.
It is very Phil Donahue.
It's so Phil Donahue. And that was like the show, right, where people seem to have feelings on TV for the first time.
It's so interesting watching this video that you and I watched, this John Bradshaw video, which is going to be in the link, I remember exactly every minute of it, seeing it before, back around the time that it was made. And some of the words in there are things I still use to this day, talking about a human doing instead of a human being. That's a regular part of my preaching repertoire. I talk about that quite a bit. What people should know is this is someone who came out in the 80s and was talking about shame and wrote two significant books for me. And that was Healing the Shame That Binds You. And then the next book called Homecoming, that really was the first discussion I came across of an inner child and nurturing that inner child, helping that inner child heal so that you could become a healed adult person.
And that's one of the beautiful things that he talks about. That was one of the notes that I wrote down, that we come into the world as precious, unique children, full of love and life. And all we need is some basic trust. All we need is some trust, and how everything that we decide what we're going to do and who we're going to be is based on modeling.
Yeah.
Everything. That there's nothing else that so dramatically or so singularly constitutes the people we become than the modeling that we see, and how we incorporate that modeling and make sense of it as those precious, unique children, not as adults, but as children.
Right. He talks about the power of how shame becomes internalized within us, so that it hooks up with these things that then happen in everyday life, like the collect we were talking about, a collect for Ash Wednesday that mentions wretchedness and penitence and those kinds of words, that if I'm walking around with a lot of internalized shame, I'm going to hook up with that, and it's going to be a negative experience for me. But he talked about shame-based modeling, abandonment, which is, as a child of an addict, mom was there, but she was using, so she wasn't really there. Any form of abuse, whether it's sexual, physical, or emotional, and perfectionism. But the top of that list, as you rightly point out, is shame-based modeling. When you've got shame-based parents, you're going to internalize some of their shame into yourself, and it's going to become part of you.
So to me, John Bradshaw is a precursor to Brene Brown, right?
Yeah.
And you and I talked about, this is perennial wisdom. This is wisdom that is spoken and put into words for a particular time and place by certain people. So in some ways, nothing that I heard from him was any different than Brene Brown, but of course it was different because it was him. But one of the things in Brene's work, especially when I'm facilitating it, that comes up, it is so hard to want to be honest with yourself, with the reality of your parents, and to do so in a way where you love them still, right? You see them as full human beings, and kind of get to this place of it's okay that these things happened. And I can only speak for myself and my experiences, which were traumatic. I don't even know if it's like a place of forgiveness so much as a place of, I have such distance now because I'm a certain age.
Yes.
I guess maybe I don't need the things from them that I maybe once did, but I'm just able to look at it with a little more objectivity.
I was watching some of the coverage around when Harry and Meghan did their interview with Oprah.
Mm-hmm.
And I just saw a clip probably on the internet. He was saying some things about his family, how disappointed he was, how he had been hurt by his family, some of their reactions to him and his wife, and some of the racism that his wife faced. And the way he was articulating it, I thought, he sounds like somebody with about 4 years of therapy under their belt. And sure enough, later in some of the materials that came out, it said, yes, I've been in therapy since I met well, Meghan. It's been about 4 years now. I was like, oh, there it is. And for a second, I just kind of thought about, what might he have to say at 8 years in therapy and 12 years? Part of that journey of discovery is that you recognize that that some of the people who raised you did their best, but at the same time did some things that have caused you trouble, have caused you distress in living your own life. Parents are supposed to nurture you to be the best person you can be, and they try, and sometimes they instill things like shame in you, and they've got their own problems, and they fall short of the mark. And you when you first discover that, when you uncover it, as Bradshaw says, when you're willing to go through that pain, to actually admit that you're in pain, then begins a process of looking at it. And later on, you realize that you can't undo those things. You're going to have to do some work to heal that pain. And you say, okay, I'm going to do these things that's going to help me heal the pain and the toxic shame that I feel within me. And sometimes that involves changing the people around you. You need to, if you're in a toxic relationship, toxic work situation, you need to make some different choices about those things. But often it's the interior work. And then, I don't know, at about 12 years, you realize, wow, that's a lot of work. And no matter how much I want to do it and how much I am committed to it, it takes time and it takes concentration, and it's not a linear path. It's more circular, and then you do that, and then later on you go, wow, I'm able to do some good for myself. I've been able to heal a lot of this, but some of it is still there. Maybe it's not possible to heal it all. Maybe my parents had some that they got from their parents, and they passed some of it down. And the best I can do is recognize that, is to work out my own salvation with fear and trembling, as St. Paul says, and try to forgive the other people who are probably on some level, whether they're aware of it or not, trying to do the same thing.
I mean, I went into therapy very specifically because I knew I was becoming a priest. I remember thinking she was going to teach me the tools to be a good priest. Like I needed, because I came from an alcoholic system, traumatic experiences, I knew that was somehow connected with my desire to want to help people. Like I had some awareness of that.
Yep.
And not, just use the word save people. But I thought therapy was going to give me the tools I needed so that I could do that without hurting anybody.
Mm-hmm.
I did not go into therapy to heal myself. And it took me several years. Intellectually, I could understand things very quickly, right? I could see things, I could understand them, I could think about them. They made sense. What took a much longer time, and that's why I actually have my hand on my heart in this moment, and listening to you, is that it's not just an understanding that's intellectual. It's I truly need to have some emotional catharsis, some emotional experiences that I was either denied or didn't feel seen by the people I needed them to see. And so it became a way in which for me to heal through that, which is definitely not linear. And I think
No.
it's courageous work. I mean, it's hard work to go do that.
Well, and this is the aspect of what we do that is essentially sacrificial. You had a sense that in order for you to do your work, you were going to have to do some work.
Mm-hmm.
I think as simply put as it is, you need that. And we all do. Most of us who come to this work have some woundedness, and that draws us in. And there's getting to a redemption. To be able to preach a redemption, we have to experience a redemption in some respects. And the best of us are people who are willing to encounter themselves on the way to Calvary. And, there's always Easter Day. Easter is always coming, but you don't get a get out of Good Friday free card in this vocation that we have. So the best of us realize that and do that work.
One of the gifts and challenges and realities of being a parent is even when you think you've kind of gotten it all healed and worked out, all of a sudden you learn from your child, actually, I don't have it all healed and worked out. I don't know how to, I can say all these things with stories. So, and that's one of the things, by the way, that's so powerful about John Bradshaw speaking. He embodied certain qualities of shaming people and qualities of how children receive, or adults even receive that. It's very powerful to watch that. When he's imitating the parent who says, like, why can't you be like Johnny? Why can't you be like Susan? Why can't you be like this other person? They have their stuff together. I don't know. I feel a connection with those kinds of experiences. And you can see people being like, really? That's shaming? Because it's so common. It's so common for us to constantly compare ourselves to other people because we had people in our lives who taught us to do that. And the world kind of teaches us to do that.
Someone shared on the internet an experience they witnessed at Target recently where a little kid, he was an older toddler, so a young child, probably preschool, was with Target and he had a drink, some sort of special drink with him. And they went into the toy aisle and he got really excited and he dropped his drink, made a huge mess on the floor. And he was very upset. And his father knelt down and comforted him and said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I know you really love that special drink. And now it's all over the floor. I'm really, really sorry. Are you going to be okay? Are you, and let him kind of have all of his feelings about it." And this was the part the person related online. They walked away and he said, you have a really smart brain. And your brain is capable of being really excited about the stuff on the toy aisle and holding on to your drink at the same time. And someday your brain is going to be able to do that. Let's go tell somebody that we made a mess and ask them to get them to clean it up.
Wow.
That whole experience, right? Of a kid, a toddler is going to occasionally drop things, and being allowed to have his disappointment about his dropping his hot chocolate or whatever it was that he wanted to drink, and recognizing why he did it. He's overwhelmed. Too many good things are happening at once, but someday his brain is going to figure out how to be excited about something and hold on to his drink.
Well, by the way, though, as a child, maybe he didn't even recognize it. That doesn't even matter. His father just gave him permission to be who he was.
Yeah, to have all the feelings.
All the feelings.
And to assure him and to assure him that that there was a way in which he would be capable of conducting himself in a way that he wouldn't always have to feel this way.
Right.
He wouldn't always be doing this thing that caused himself pain.
Okay, so let's talk just for a second then. So this is exactly what I'm talking about in terms of giving up shame for Lent, or giving up whatever it is that's keeping us from wanting to shine a light on these parts of ourselves that maybe if we examine them, even if we're not quite fearless yet, they actually are the things that are going to draw us closer into our relationship with not just who we are, but God, if that's something we're longing for. And that's this idea that we have to understand and be penitent for all the ways in which we don't measure up.
Mm.
Okay, so let's just talk about one little story in the Bible for a second. That is my favorite story. It's Luke 15. I hope I got that right. Luke 15, best chapter in all the Gospels, hands down, because it's just the summary of all the Gospels. It's 3 stories about God told by Jesus. The first story is the shepherd who loses a sheep, and he leaves 99 of them to go find that one lost sheep, which makes no sense because 99 sheep are worth a hell of a lot more than one. The next story is a woman who loses a coin. She spends all freaking day trying to find one stupid coin. She finds it and then calls all her neighbors to rejoice. Also totally ridiculous, not worth that much of a party. And she would have to spend that coin just to have that much fun. Then the last story, the kicker, the best story, the prodigal son. The son demands his inheritance from his father, leaves, leaving his older brother there, who does all the work, is the perfect child, goes off, spends all the money, disrepute living, tries to get some food by working at a pig farm, all of a sudden realizes he's covered in muck, he's starving, and thinks to himself, I'll go back to my dad's and he will at least treat me as good as he treats the hired hands.
Right.
When his dad sees him coming down the road, his dad runs out to meet him. And that verb is in the Gospels.
Yeah.
Welcomes him home with open arms. The son never, not once, says he's sorry. All he says is, can I be treated like one of your hired hands? That's it.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't apologize for anything. Father not only says, I'm so glad you're home, but let's throw a huge party to celebrate. I'm going to give you a ring. I'm going to give you a coat. We're going to roast a fatted pig. It's going to be awesome. And the elder brother stands by looking at him, resentment building and building and building, and finally looks at his dad and said, what the, you know what?
Yeah.
Here I am doing everything for you. And this is how you receive him. And you don't even offer to give me anything. Mm-hmm. And the dad just looks at him, bewildered that he's jealous of so much grace and love, saying, what would you expect? Your brother was lost and now he's found. Mm-hmm. Of course.
And you have been with me this whole time.
You've been here the whole time. Didn't you know I loved you? You've been here the whole time. Mm-hmm. And I guess the eldest son, then the story ends, right? Okay, that's it. That's the story. Yeah. The eldest son is left. We don't know what he does. We don't know what happens next. The younger son could go off and spend another gargantuan fortune on something because he's truly given no indication that he understands the negligence of his actions or the way he's treated his father. None of that matters.
Well, one point though, the pivot point for the prodigal son, for the younger son, is while he's away in a very shameful situation, because he's having to take care of the pigs, which was a taboo, wasn't food, they didn't have anything to do with it. And so he's in this very shameful situation. And what it says, the way we translate it is, he came to himself. He came to himself. So there was a reclamation, whatever that was, there was a reclamation of self that says, I've done some things that are wrong.
Wait, but how do you make that leap? He came to himself is not saying an awareness of doing something wrong.
Well, I think you make a very big point, I noticed in your recounting of it, that he doesn't apologize. But I would say that there's a sense that he's in a shameful situation through his own actions. He's broke through his own actions. He's hungry through his own actions. He's having to do demeaning work because of his own actions. And he comes to himself. He recognizes, I interpret that as saying, he recognizes that his own actions have led him to the place where he is. And so he knows of one place where he can at least have some dignity, even though it would be a dignity of the position he treated so badly. It was a dignity that he could at least eat better and not have to not do the shameful, not be involved in the shameful situation. Mm-hmm. That's how I interpret that.
No. That to me is a is a nuanced interpretation that doesn't assume him saying, I'm sorry.
No, he doesn't. In a sense, he doesn't get a chance to.
No, the grace is too powerful. The love is too strong. The love maybe doesn't require it. And so first of all, like, let's say my friends out there, maybe you see some of why Mark and I and other people, like, I know the Bible is this thing, but actually it's kind of amazing.
Yeah. It keeps on selling.
It
2,000
does.
years later.
It does. And it's kind of ridiculous. You and I preach on these stories, again and again and again and again. But one of the joys and one of the phrases I love that our presiding bishop, Michael Curry, says, I remember him preaching once, to saturate yourself in the stories of Scripture. And to me, saturating yourself in the story of Scripture is to make it your own. It's to read a bunch of different translations, to picture the story. And then you're right, Mark, I do interpret it a certain way because I'm bringing my story into the story, and same for you.
As it should be. That's how those stories, that's how our faith lives now. And the fact of the matter is, there's all these discussions we won't get into about whether the Bible is literally true. Nobody asserts that there was a prodigal son and a forgiving father. It's a story. It's a story that helps people understand God. So that's how we're interpreting it still to this day. But one of the ways I love to think about that is in terms of internal family systems, and recognize that the father, the resentful older brother, and the prodigal son are all parts of ourselves.
Yes,
they're all parts of ourselves. So a fruitful Lenten practice might be putting yourself as each of those people, the person who can recognize that their own choices have led them to an undignified portion in life, a person who can just be overjoyed when we come to ourselves, just be grateful for that. And also a part of ourselves that can be resentful if we feel that other people are getting more for doing less.
And then we can get curious about that. I mean, I don't know that resentment's going to lead to much fruitful stuff, honestly, personally.
But what I like about Jesus is he put that part that, the resentful older brother is part of the story. It makes a better story without him. It's a more positive story. It might be more palatable to us without him. But there's that older brother who has to hear, who needs his own kind of grace administered by his father. You've been here. You haven't been lost.
Right.
I think about these arguments now when we look at different approaches to crime that are not punitive, but instead look at poverty and some of the issues that are underneath it, and racism. This happens a lot in the area of the country in the era I grew up in. It's like, why are those people being rewarded for doing bad? That same discussion is going on in some of our public life today. They sound like the older brother. It's like people are suffering. They were lost.
And he tells that story in response to some religious authorities standing around being very resentful. Mm-hmm. Why is he eating with tax collectors and sinners? Why is he spending this time with the people who are unclean, unworthy, who don't follow all the rules, who don't check all the boxes? Why is he eating with them? He should be eating with us. And, what's this say about how we're the ones that are supposed to be mitigating people's relationship with God through this system of holiness? Yeah. And Jesus is saying, no, it's a system of humanness.
I will point out too that second story about the missing coin.
Yeah.
You and I were sitting in a New Testament class.
It's crazy. New Testament, I always have these memories that I don't have from seminary. It scares me every time you start.
You and I were sitting in New Testament class, and this story came up. I recounted a scholar that I'd read that talked about the 10 coins being part of a dowry. And so it was really, there's a feminist reading of this to talk about the woman regaining some of her economic power because the dowry becomes part of her. And our New Testament professor said, that's BS, and you should watch who you read, and don't bring that stuff up in class. And totally shamed me in the whole class right then and there. And I was like, and that professor wound up being one that many of our colleagues and fellow students think of as so empowering. And I was like, I'm not buying it. I have
Well,
issues.
so this is the thing, right? About shame. No
Yeah.
matter how wise, good, and how much work we do, I don't know you get to a place in life. I don't imagine I'll get to a place in life where I'll be completely free of utilizing it as a tool. Maybe. I mean, maybe I really hope so, because when I do utilize it as a tool, I want to hope that I'm being not super aware, like I'm having some sort of
Hmm.
knee-jerk response. I mean, watching that Bradshaw, and I had kind of forgotten about how he was the one that came up with the whole inner child thing. And I certainly
Hmm.
remember when that was very prominent in our world, right? Like, tend to your inner child. What does your inner child say? And it was always greeted cynically and as if that was ridiculously stupid and like, give me a
Derisively, yeah.
break. Yeah, totally derisive. And I actually it was a spiritual director, and she told me, she was a nun, she encouraged me to have some conversations with my inner child. And at first I was like, I can't do this. Like, I was like, this is ridiculous. But now I encourage people to do the same thing, because it is
Hmm.
incredibly healing, because we are these precious, unique little children.
One of the retreat exercises I've done before is to have everybody take a pack of Post-it and try to remember, spend a few minutes meditating and reflecting on who they were as a small child, who they were at the age of 10 or younger. What did they like? What did they enjoy? What was their personality like? What were they afraid of? How did they have fun? And write down all of those things, all of the attributes of who they knew themselves to be, as much as they could remember at the age of 10, because developmentally 10 is about the age where you start to become a conscious, and even without trauma, you begin to sort of work your way into society. And so there are comparisons, and you become aware of other people's needs, and you occasionally become aware that your parents are not perfect, or not super people. That was it's such an interesting exercise, because there is a part of you that is still that perfect little elf, I think.
Mhm.
Bradshaw discussed, who's got everything they need to be a happy, healthy child of God in every aspect, in every moment of their lives. And somehow or another, those communities, those societies, which you and I have found great joy in, experience God in, can also do other things to us as well.
And
And it's kind of tough.
maybe well, I know there is tremendous value, but maybe one of the things to both take on and give up around Lent as a practice is, maybe it's a Bible story, maybe it's a story from something else, but a story that for you represents, I don't know, it just touches your heart in a certain way, because there's something about
Mm.
that story that just speaks to your own experience. And to just spend some time wondering about what that story might be inviting you to look at in yourself.
Mm.
What might it be inviting you to shine some light on and get curious about, and to examine with tenderness and kindness, not needing to necessarily get to an answer. It's not, I don't want to, I'm trying to avoid making it sound like a self-improvement project, because, I get a little exhausted of thinking everything about this
Yeah.
is it's not about a self-improvement. It's more like just living life content and happy and accepting and joyful.
I think I like to think of it as becoming more and more authentic with ourselves, and hopefully the people around us, if we're in those kind of environments that reward that. It's a process of not improving yourself, but mapping more of yourself for yourself, so you can encounter some of those things, and to look at our woundedness as this is going to be really tough for some people, and it's not appropriate in every situation, but look at our woundedness in some respects for the way it can be gifts for us as well. I think about the growing up in my alcoholic home, and how I had to walk in the door from school and immediately know, was my mom high or not? Was dinner going to happen? Did I have to make dinner happen? Was my father angry about it or not? We were kept having to hide it from my brother. Was he being aware? Was there a pot on the stove? Was the stove on? Was anybody paying attention? Like all of those sensory antennas. And now all of those antennas were installed by that experience. And I've learned how to turn them off, but I've also learned how to tune them in when my people come to me and say, I'd like to talk to you. And I can sit down and turn them all on and say, they're all focused on you. I'm going to hear what you say. I'm going to watch the way you say it. I'm going to hear what you're not saying and try to be a companion to you using those antennas, which for a big part of my life were overwhelming me, taking care of other people's needs.
Well, yeah, I mean, in some ways you're talking about the way our wounds become ways in which we heal, because we understand how they can be used for good. They can be used to build people up. I mean, because I think we've talked about this, lots of the skills you learn in a household that you and I grew up in, they serve you really well for a period of time. I mean, they for me, I was very achievement oriented. I could think of a million things. I mean, I can micromanage myself. I can get so many things done. I can please a lot of people. I can get ahead of problems. I can all of that kind of stuff. And it works for a certain period of time. And then it sort of stops being able to work. It's not a sustainable solution.
And I think some of the things that we can look towards during Lent are that the whole point of life is to have a Good Friday that then gets redeemed in new life. That there's not some perfect place out there where we don't get wounded by the world and by life. The point is to experience our wounds, knowing that there is healing and new life and a new understanding. The point is not to never leave your father. It doesn't seem to do much good for the older brother, but that younger brother running up the road, seeing the face of a forgiving, merciful father, has had an experience of his father's love that his brother clearly can't access. It was through his coming to himself, recognizing his woundedness in a way, we could say, that deepens his relationship with that father. And that to me is a useful Lenten journey, looking at our sins and shortcomings, looking at our woundedness, letting them lead us into our own healing and a deepening of our relationship, both with ourselves and with a God that I believe is merciful beyond any measure of the mind.
Thank you. What you just said was very beautiful. Some of what you were describing was when Bradshaw makes the distinction that Brene Brown doesn't make. He talks about toxic shame and healthy shame.
Yes.
And toxic shame is the same definition that I read from Atlas of the Heart, that, idea that I am a flawed human being. But healthy shame is what you described as, maybe that prodigal son comes to himself and recognizes his limitations. And regardless of how he feels about it, he definitely recognizes his need.
Yeah. Bradshaw talks about the difference between kind of a healthy shame and an unhealthy shame. A healthy shame is saying, I made a mistake. Unhealthy shame is, I am a mistake. So what I did wasn't good. Admitting that instead of believing I am no good. Where we internalize and it becomes a characteristic of ourselves, because we can all change. It's hard to see that sometimes. Recently I was at a 12-step meeting that was an anniversary meeting. And so someone shares that they're celebrating their sober anniversary, and we go around the room, and the topic of the sharing is often gratitude. And I was near the end of the line. So people, as they shared, kept taking my thing that I was going to say I was grateful for. And about 2 or 3 people away, I was like, what do I want? What am I really grateful for here? Yes, I'm grateful not to wake up with a hangover every day, those kind of things. And I thought, the thing that I'm most grateful for is the knowledge that I can change. I didn't believe I could change when I was drinking and drugging. I didn't believe it. But I ran into some people who said, no, you can. And I didn't know how to do it. I didn't believe it really existed. I certainly didn't think I was capable of it. And these people said, don't think about it too much. Just try not to drink tomorrow and come back to one of these meetings and listen to what our experiences of that. And the belief that I can change, even if I don't know how, I don't know what lays ahead, I don't know all of the steps I need to take. Someone saying, no, you can take this step. That's all I need in order to create miraculous change in my life. And so that idea that change, redemption, I would call it, resurrection, is possible, whether you believe it or know it or not, whether that intellectual part of your brain can see it or not. That's the grace of the faith that we live in these stories, I think.
You're saying that word, whether you believe it, it's in some ways like, even with faith, people say things like, oh, I wish I had the faith you had. And I'm like, I don't know where you think this well of faith I have is, but a lot of what I do, I just do it. Like, I don't always have some feeling of assurance or certainty that it's going to lead to whatever the outcome is we say it's going to be. But I trust in that God that's going to run down the road. Like that's all that matters to me. That God's going to run down the road no matter what.
Well, and something you said a little bit earlier in our conversation, and this is a whole nother podcast, but desire, when we desire it, that part, I think that's one of the things that we often overlook and that's really not an intellectual idea. Oh, can't you see that your drinking is causing all these problems? No, but I really desire a healing. I desire God. I desire a closer relationship with God. It's the desire, I think, that gets you there. Being able to admit that you want something that you don't have.
Yeah, maybe that's a great thing to take on for Lent. Some sort of looking at our desires and what are the desires in our lives are for ourselves, not in a selfish way that's putting anybody else down, but are for ourselves because we get this one precious life.
Yeah.
And Bradshaw says that too. He says, how you live is how you will die. Right.
And what you give your time to is what's important to you, is what you love.
What you give your time to is what you love. That was actually, honestly, that made me think like, oh, okay, I guess my podcast is okay.
Go ahead. You love it. You spend a lot of time on it.
Yeah, I do. And and it's like, for what? Like, part of me, the shame voice in my head is like, well, what's the point? Like, you're not making money at it. Is it just narcissistic, Ariane? Are you just out there because you want to be more like prominent in the world or something? There's a lot of shame voices when you do something like this.
I don't hate the fact that you want people to notice you. I think that's great. All of the best things in life are brought about by people like that. Another thing, just to get back to that desire thing, one of the exercises my spiritual director gave me in one of our sessions is, Mark, I want you to try to spend some time meditating, praying, thinking about what is your deepest desire? What is your deepest desire? Because your deepest desire is God's will for you.
Amen.
God wants to give you your deepest desire. So that's a profitable Lent, isn't it? Spend 40 days thinking about what is your deepest desire underneath it all.
Well, not at all coincidentally, obviously, my spiritual director and I this week we're talking around a little thing called surrender.
Yeah.
That I think connects with desire. As she's been encouraging me for a couple of years now to surrender more things to God and stop thinking that I can control them. Don't laugh too hard.
Can you give me her number? Because
I was saying that one of the sort of graces I've had lately, because my life has been such that I've almost had to surrender out of necessity, not out of choice, right? I truly cannot manage everything. And it's part of this wheel of connection. The surrendering, whatever it is, in some way not only gives to whomever or whatever situation, but it also gives me something too. When you're talking about this idea that desire is also God's desire, that's because it is going to connect in the world. Like the love thing for me with this podcast is I have a deep desire to connect with other people in a very intentional way.
It's like writers who talk about the most important thing to them is to think that their words have found a reader. Can Same thing. This is a season of annual meetings in our professional life, and we're talking about refounding our preschool and talk about surrendering and trusting in God. And one of the things I said to my people is, one of the things we are really going to have to believe in, that we are going to have to trust in God's goodwill towards us. Because I can't tell you how everything's going to work out. I can't tell you where every dollar is going to come from. But I can look back at our time in this pandemic. I can look back at our time. My parish was here during the first pandemic and the Spanish flu epidemic. And look at God. God has prospered every work that we've tried to do in God's name. We're going to have to trust and surrender to God's goodwill for us and believe that it's there.
That's probably a good place to draw this
Are we done?
conversation.
Have we been talking for 3 days? It feels like we've covered a lot of ground area.
I hope this is an encouragement to folks to enter into a season, whatever it is, maybe Lent's not even a part of your world, but to consider ways in which you might curiously cultivate some desire in your life that's about fulfilling who you are. So thank you, Mark.
Well, and there's part of the prayer book that we didn't like too much, but there's one line that one of my favorite to say every year. I invite you, therefore, to the observance of a holy Lent. Whatever that holiness is for you, let's hope that people can find a little bit of it for themselves, because that really is God's will for all of us. Encounter our own holiness.
Yep. Thank you, Mark Collins.
Thank you.
All right.
Nice. And thank you, John Bradshaw.
Yeah, thanks, John Bradshaw.
Brown.
People go watch this YouTube and see where it touches lands with you.
Yeah.
All right. Take care, my friends.
Take care.